G'day and welcome to the first. Oh, wait, I'm looking at the wrong spot. We gotta go here. Okay. Hello and welcome to the first episode of Busy Brains Hub. This is my first time using this new webcam and hopefully it's looking pretty good. I decided to record this in my bedroom because often when I do podcasts, I sit at my desk and do it, and I actually really don't enjoy sitting at my desk, and that makes podcasting a drag. And I'm saying it like I've podcasted a lot, and you're like, this is episode 1, Lauren, what are you talking about? But I do have other shows that I've done before. I had this one show that like became another show and became another show, and it was all the same audience. And this time I just thought, you know what, I'll just start a new podcast, so much easier. So today we're going to be talking about what are busy brains, but as the title said, we're also going to be talking about the irony of getting a formal diagnosis, and I'll tell you a little bit about my experience as well. So let's start with just, what do we mean when we're just talking busy brains? Are we talking neurodivergence? Are we talking ADHD? Are we talking anxiety disorders? What are we talking about? I actually recently saw this term being used by a supplement company, and I just thought, oh, that's such a good way to sort of encapsulate the challenges I am coaching people on how to sort of overcome. And, I guess coaching, it's funny, it's a little bit like teaching. It's sort of like usually the very thing that you're coaching people on are the things that you've struggled with yourself. I mean, that's a pattern that I've noticed anyway. And so it's kind of funny for me. I have been looking into getting a diagnosis to figure out what's going on exactly with my brain. For a number of years, I've contemplated that. And I ended up falling into sort of coaching mostly neurodivergent students. And then kind of more and more realize, oh yeah, definitely there's something, here for me as well to learn about myself. So I want to share a little bit about the journey I'm on. And back to that question, what is a busy brain? What do we mean by that? I think more and more of the research into neurodivergent sort of areas. So when I say that, that encapsulates everything from, clinically diagnosable conditions like ADHD, ASD, complex PTSD, depression, mental health issues, even things like psychopathy, sociopathy, generally referred to as psychopathy type 1 and type 2 now. There's a lot better understanding of all the different ways that our brains can work. And it's actually estimated that like 20% of the population are neurodivergent in some way. So I mentioned those formal diagnosable things, but also we need to take into consideration the fact that many of us might have subclinical conditions. So you can have subclinical ADHD, which means that you experience a lot of the ADHD symptoms, but it might not just be at that threshold where you can be considered formally diagnosed. And it doesn't mean that you don't struggle with certain things or that your brain is neurotypical. So neurodivergence and the idea of being a part of the neurodivergent community, now that's a term that's existed for quite a long time. It was actually a term coined by an Australian, and I got to meet her. Her name at the moment, I'll put it in like the show notes. I'll put it somewhere. I want to make sure that I credit her, but the name escapes me at the moment. And I think, now we're also starting to see, I heard this from a nutrition researcher recently, that like sort of just around the corner will be more research into areas like how, say, menopause might exacerbate certain issues, how hormones interplay with these different conditions. There's also talk about like prevalence of and a crossover between neurodivergence and members of the LGBT community. I am a member of the LGBT plus community as well. And I just think there's so much more to explore and kind of figure out there. Now, if you tuned into this thinking, Lauren, you did say that this was also a comedy podcast. I can't promise that I'll be funny all of the time, but I do want to bring a flavor of humor into this. If you follow me on TikTok or YouTube, you might have seen recently in the last couple of months, I've really been pushing more and more comedy sort of content, because I think edutainment and comedy is such a great way to understand more and more of this. And it also it helps me just have an outlet for my creativity. And I guess, one thing I've noticed recently, I went and did my first sort of open mic stand up just like last week, and I will be continuing to do that too. And what I noticed about doing that was it was actually such a great way. It was actually sort of more effective for me than therapy in dealing with some of the things that I'm trying to deal with. It was just such a great outlet to sort of explore concepts in a way that was fun, and I just got such a buzz from it too. So anyway, my name's Lauren, by the way. Probably should have mentioned that. I am going to try to do this podcast in a way where I'm not masking too much. So if I'm sort of rambling a little bit, then please feel free to like double speed the podcast or double speed the video to speed it up. I think I do that a lot, and I think it really helps. I will also try not to say too many ums and ahs. That's sometimes really hard for me, but I will do my best. Okay, so we've kind of covered what do we mean by busy brains. Great. I've mentioned comedy as therapy. Awesome. That was also on my list. Okay, let's talk a little bit about getting a diagnosis. So I did actually try to write a bit about this for my first stand-up night, but it was just a bit too long-winded, and I decided to cut it. But I do think there's something really strange about getting a diagnosis. So I'm going to use my situation as an example, and this might not be everyone's scenario, of course, but basically where I'm at the moment is that I am about almost exactly a month, maybe just shy of a month, of attending my first ever psychiatrist appointment. And I am going to see a psychiatrist who is well versed in ADHD specifically. And it's taken, I think I've waited about 6 months for this appointment, which isn't too bad. The thing I think is really interesting about getting a diagnosis is how it sort of interplays with all of these sort of common symptoms of ADHD and other neurodivergent conditions. So I just want to kind of walk through that quickly. Okay, firstly, if we think of some of the most common prominent symptoms of ADHD across all its different types, we have, you're more likely to be more forgetful, to run late to appointments, to find some of those like administrative tasks really quite draining or difficult to act on, to feel motivated to do it, something I definitely struggle with. And we've got this situation where we have people in that boat having to go to a GP or a psychologist and be self-aware enough to have paid attention to, a condition that also means that you have, varying attention. It's hard to pay, or for me anyway, it's very hard for me to pay attention to my behavior and what I do at times. Be able to communicate to that GP or psychologist. Eventually everyone's going to end up at the GP in Australia because you need to get a referral, right? So let's say at the GP, you've got to be able to communicate, get that appointment, communicate to the GP what you need. And then you need to try to find a psychiatrist who will actually see you. And that is also a massive administrative task, right? So for me, I think I rang around like 4 different places, and one eventually picked up. Like a bunch of them just never got back to me. We have a whole issue with psychiatrists in Australia at the moment. There were going to be a bunch that sort of pulled out because of issues with understaffing in hospitals, and I'm sure some of you are aware of the issues with that. Some psychiatrists have decided to stay in practice, so not quite as many were going to resign as previously thought. Some of them ended up not resigning, but there still is this whole issue with private psychiatrists pulling out because of what's happening in the public sector. And then, so I did get, after booking this appointment, paying a deposit, I did get an email saying we may have to move your appointment. And then, yeah, you've got to wait a really long time. You need to do more paperwork. And in that waiting time, I think what's also really tricky is for a lot of us, we may also struggle with comorbidities, right? So other conditions like an anxiety disorder or other mental health challenges, depression, and even just that sense of not having clarity around your identity is really common. Feeling a sense of rejection, so having rejection sensitivity, so feeling more rejected than what a lot of other people would feel, having that fear of rejection, like all of those things interplay. So for example, something as simple as being like, I need to call and make an appointment. For me, I'm like, I have to phone someone. That in of itself is a barrier. I don't like calling people. I don't like having to navigate that conversation on the phone. I often will repeat the conversation multiple times in my head of like exactly what I need to say before I call. I find it very hard to just pick up the phone and call. And it's ironic because when one of my first jobs was working as a medical receptionist, so I grew up with this massive fear of phones. And then I just kind of fell into being able to get a job as a medical receptionist, and I had to answer the phone all the time. And in a way it was okay because I had like a script to follow. But even now, even though I've worked on the other side of it and I know what it's like to be working at a specialist, doing the reception work, I still have a fear around this. So even though I've got experience with it, I still struggle. So I'm like, what about other people who maybe don't, who maybe have that same fear? And then once you get that appointment, obviously, yeah, you have to wait. You're filling in all this paperwork that's asking you questions about things around your childhood, around, what did you do when you were a child? For me, that meant then I had to bring up that conversation with my mum, because I was kind of like second guessing myself, going, wait, did I really do that? I don't know if I did that or not. And then that brought her into it and her thoughts into it, which also then, whether she meant for it to or not, for me, added to this sense of questioning myself, kind of wanting to make sure that I was still accepted. Like it just becomes this real like challenge. And to the point where I'm just like, it's really ironic because I feel like for me, based on all of the self-diagnosis testing I've done, I've come up as like mild to moderate ADHD. That's what I keep coming up as. I also seem to have some ASD symptoms, again, waiting for a formal diagnosis. So I don't know what any of that truly means, but I do know what it's like to live in my brain, and I don't know what it's like to live in anyone else's, right? But I'm like, okay, so let's say I had mild to moderate ADHD. What's it like for people with more severe ADHD? Like you've got to turn up to an appointment. I'm like, I'm pretty good at turning up to appointments because I'm like really meticulous with like keeping organized, putting dates in my diary, doing all of that kind of stuff. And I've got this thought in the back of my head, and this is what my joke was going to be around, was like, part of me just wants to go in and like ham up the whole ADHD thing, because honestly, I feel like I really have built this identity now around being someone who has ADHD, feeling like I've found a community that I can like partake in, but also feeling like an imposter because I'm like, it's not cool to say you have a condition if maybe you don't, because you don't know, you don't have a diagnosis, right? So it's like, okay, I'm not really part of this, but I kind of feel like I have a deeper sense of self now. And I don't want to go to a psychiatrist and have that taken away from me just because I turn up to the appointment on time. And obviously that's ridiculous. Like a psychiatrist can't diagnose you as like, or not diagnose you with ADHD based on turning up to an appointment. But it just feels that ironic. Like it feels that ironic that I'm like, every step of this is going to be challenging. And I just wonder how many people are like, struggling to get themselves to actually go through this process, and whether this process is even necessary. The other ironic thing that I've been finding is that in the past, when I was less worried about what this could be, is I kind of just have been managing things myself. So I will, I'm very active. I go to the gym. I mean, at the moment I can't because I got some stitches, nothing dramatic, but I've been able to go to the gym for about a week, which has been really interesting. I've turned to my nutrition a lot more, and I especially do if I know that I can't be active, because I'm like, that is such an important tool for me for like keeping myself feeling sane, right? And so it's like, okay, hang on, I've got to maybe not do some of these things. This is what I feel like. I feel like maybe I need to not do some of these things so I can actually see what like baseline is like, because I don't know anymore. Some of the questions that you get asked as part of this formal diagnosis process is things like, do you often run late to things? Do you often forget appointments? And I'm like, no, I never forget appointments. Well, I forget appointments, but I don't rely on myself to remember them because I just write them all down. Or, do you forget what you need to do? And I'm like, no, because I am really meticulous about writing lots of stuff down. I have a bullet journal. I like keep lists. I've been pretty like, I want to say the word obsessed, but obsessed is the wrong word, especially when we will probably be talking about OCD, and we may have people listening that are OCD. And I'm sorry that that term is often incorrectly used. I guess the term I'm after is more like, I did get really like over organized. I've been sort of trying to do that since a very young age. I would be really over organized. I would write schedules. I would plan things. I would try to break things up and like make sure I had a way to get things done. I've always been really interested in how do I get the things done that I need to do. And yeah, I think like because of that, from the outside, it can really look like, Lauren, you're like organized. I have people saying that to me. I was like, you're really organized. And I'm like, yeah, because I feel like I have to be, and the other thing that I think is interesting is like, I do feel like kind of trying to work this part of myself out has made me feel more fragile to people's comments around this stuff as well. So if someone says, well, everyone's forgetful, or everyone has a hard time paying attention to certain things, that kind of makes me feel like delegitimized and almost like gaslit, even if that person didn't mean to gaslight me, So I guess I wanted to share this first episode just to kind of be like, I think there's probably a lot of people that feel like this. And because this needs to be a longer like sort of conversation, it's not something I can just put up on TikTok and even YouTube. We'll see. Maybe I'll put this up on YouTube. I think it's something that can be really nice to listen to just be like, oh, I've got a buddy, a little friend in my ears that is sort of speaking my language, and just to put it out there, I do think I probably also have maybe like a subclinical OCD. So when I was younger, I did have like periods of my life where it was pretty bad. And unfortunately, I think instead of, sort of understanding more about a potential anxiety disorder, I went down the route of, a GP essentially said I have clinical depression. I think that's quite common because I started, sort of not wanting to be here anymore, and I think that was because I wanted to get outside of my brain, which again is a pretty common thing with OCD and OCD symptoms. At the moment, I am thankfully relatively on top of those symptoms because I know how I understand like intrusive thoughts, and I understand that I don't need to keep going over them, and I guess I'm not saying that to be like everyone with OCD should just do that and they'd be fine. Definitely not saying that. I'm just saying that I think for me, that's what really started to help me. And I do tend to find that I purposely don't do things, or I will purposely not watch things so that I don't end up thinking things that I don't want to think, because sometimes I feel like I can end up in a sort of like a loop and I can't get out of it. Yeah. I also have really bad driving anxiety, and I think I'm just saying all of that to be like, it's not as simple as in like when I'm saying busy brains, or when I'm talking about my busy brain, it's not as simple as it's just this one thing. And once I get this like one thing figured out, everything will be figured out. So having said all of that, yeah, I'm a coach in this stuff. I speak to people every day about how to better manage their time, how to overcome procrastination. That's a really big one that I talk about a lot. And we can talk about those things. But I just wanted to kind of start this by saying, yeah, welcome. Let's talk about busy brains. And I'm going to share some ideas of things that have like worked for me, but hopefully not in a way that is preachy, because if you're anything like me, then you don't really want to be told what to do. And I think a lot of us as neurodivergent people can relate to that. I don't really want to be told what to do. I just want to have a sense of camaraderie, and then maybe some ideas, and then I'll come up with my own solution. And so that's kind of the vibe here as well. It's not tips telling you what to do. It's just sort of like, oh, here's some things that maybe are helpful. So really curious about people's thoughts on the whole self-diagnosis, and the whole, formal diagnosis. I think it's a real privilege to be able to go and see a psychiatrist, for many reasons, including the cost. And I still have in the back of my head a massive fear that something's going to stop me from being able to attend this appointment. I'll talk next time maybe a little bit more about just how much I've overthought this appointment, and why, maybe some theories of why it's so important to me. But in the meantime, I don't have a tagline for this show yet, but I hope you can feel a little bit more balanced-ish from listening to this episode, and I'll catch you next time. Cheers.